The whisper moved through the ballroom faster than the music. "Do not look at him. Do not go near him." Evelina Ashworth heard it 3 times before she even saw his face, and by the time she did, her heart was already pounding, as if she had been running. He stood near the terrace doors, tall and unmoving, dressed in black that seemed darker than everyone else's black. Candlelight touched the sharp line of his jaw but never softened it. Duke Alaric Ravensmore did not smile. He did not bow to the women who curtsied nervously in his direction. He simply watched the room the way a wolf watches a flock it has already decided not to hunt tonight but might tomorrow. "They say his last betrothed left him standing at the altar," Charlotte whispered behind her fan, eyes bright with the thrill of gossip, "and that he has not danced with a single woman since." "They say worse than that," Margaret added, leaning close. "They say he ruined a man's family for daring to insult him, ruined them completely." Evelina rolled her eyes, though her pulse betrayed her. "You two collect rumors like other people collect ribbons." "Prove you are not afraid then," Charlotte said, a wicked grin spreading across her face. "Go and ask him to dance." The words landed in the air between them like a lit match dropped onto dry grass. Evelina's sisters had teased her for years about being too quiet, too bookish, too easily overlooked in a room full of louder, prettier women. She was the youngest, the one people forgot to introduce, the one who sat near the punch bowl while her sisters were swept onto the dance floor. Tonight, something in her refused to be forgotten. "You would not dare," Margaret said, delighted at her own daring. "Nobody would dare." Evelina looked across the crowded room at the Duke, at the empty circle of space around him that no one crossed, as though an invisible wall kept the entire ballroom at a careful distance. Her stomach twisted with fear, but beneath the fear was something else, something sharper. She was tired, tired of being the sister no one noticed, tired of being told what she would never do. "Watch me," she said, and before her sisters could stop laughing long enough to call her back, she had already stepped away from them and into the open floor. The walk across the ballroom felt endless. Conversations faltered as she passed. A woman near the refreshment table actually gasped. Someone's fan stopped moving mid-air. Evelina kept her chin high and her eyes fixed on the Duke, refusing to let her steps slow no matter how loudly her own heartbeat rang in her ears. She had never in her life been the center of a room's attention, and now, with every step, more eyes turned toward her, until it felt as though the entire ballroom was holding its breath. The Duke saw her coming. She watched something shift in his expression, not quite surprise but close to it, a flicker of interest breaking through the stillness of his face like light through a crack in a closed door. No one approached him. No one had. Not in the 2 years since he inherited the title and became, in the eyes of London, a man to be avoided rather than courted. She stopped in front of him, close enough that she could see the faint scar above his left eyebrow, the one the gossip never seemed to explain the same way twice. Up close, he was even more imposing than from across the room, but she forced her voice to stay steady. "Your Grace," she said, dropping into a curtsy that she hoped did not look as unsteady as her knees felt. "I am told no one in this room is brave enough to ask you to dance. I thought someone ought to prove that wrong." For a long moment he said nothing. The silence stretched so long that Evelina became certain she had made a terrible mistake, that he would turn away without a word and leave her standing alone in front of the entire ballroom, an object of pity and ridicule for weeks to come. She could already imagine the whispers that would follow her home. Then, slowly, one corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but close enough to change the entire shape of his face. "And who," he said, his voice low and unhurried, "is brave enough to say such a thing to my face?" "Lady Evelina Ashworth," she answered, refusing to let her voice shake. "Ashworth," he repeated, as though testing the weight of the name. "I do not believe we have been introduced." "We have not," she said. "I decided the introduction could wait until after the dance." Something changed in his eyes then, something that made the hardened lines of his face look almost boyish for a heartbeat. He studied her, the way a man studies something unexpected, something he had not planned for and was not entirely sure how to respond to. Behind her, Evelina could feel the weight of 100 stares, could hear the music continuing without them as though the entire orchestra was waiting to see what would happen next. "Very well, Lady Evelina," he said finally, and extended his hand. "Let us give them something to talk about." The moment his gloved fingers closed around hers, a ripple of astonished murmurs swept across the ballroom, loud enough that Evelina could hear fragments of it even as the Duke led her onto the dance floor. She caught sight of her sisters near the wall, both of them frozen with their mouths slightly open, fans forgotten in their hands. Lady Constance Fenwick, who had spent the better part of 2 seasons trying to secure the Duke's attention through every polite and impolite means available to a woman of standing, stood rigid near the punch table, her expression twisting from disbelief into something far colder. The orchestra began a new piece, and the Duke placed one hand at Evelina's waist, the other holding hers with a firmness that surprised her. She had expected him to be stiff, mechanical, the way she imagined a man who never danced would be. Instead, he moved with an ease that suggested years of practice he simply chose never to display. "You are trembling," he observed as they began to move through the steps. "I am not accustomed to being watched," she admitted. "You should have thought of that before crossing an entire ballroom to speak to the man everyone avoids." "I did think of it," she said. "I simply decided it was worth the risk." He tilted his head slightly, studying her with an intensity that made her cheeks warm. "And why is that?" Evelina considered lying, offering some polite excuse about curiosity or boredom. Instead, she found herself telling the truth. "Because I am tired of being told what I am too afraid to do. My sisters dared me, Your Grace. I do not intend to let a dare defeat me." A short, surprised sound left him, not quite a laugh, but close enough that several nearby dancers turned to look, as though the sound itself was unnatural coming from him. Most women in this room would faint at the thought of speaking so plainly to a duke. "I am not most women." "No," he said, his gaze steady on hers as they turned through the next figure of the dance. "I am beginning to see that." The dance continued, and with every step, Evelina felt the strange tension in her chest ease slightly, replaced by something else entirely, a curiosity she had not expected to feel toward a man the whole of London seemed determined to fear. He asked her questions that no one else at these events ever bothered to ask, about the books she read, about her opinions on subjects most gentlemen assumed young ladies had no thoughts on at all. She found herself answering honestly, forgetting for long stretches that half the room was still watching them. When the music finally slowed and the dance came to its natural end, Evelina expected him to release her hand, bow and retreat back into his solitary corner, as though the entire encounter had been a brief and forgettable diversion. Instead, his hand remained closed around hers, firm and unmoving. "Your Grace," she said quietly, glancing down at their joined hands, aware of how many eyes were still fixed upon them. "The dance has ended." "I am aware," he said, making no move to let go. "Then perhaps you ought to release my hand, before the entire room decides we are engaged." Something flickered across his face again, that same rare, almost smile. Would that be so terrible a rumor? Evelina's breath caught. Before she could form a response, he stepped closer instead of away, lowering his voice so that only she could hear him over the murmur of the crowd and the shuffling of the next dance forming around them. "I find," he said, "that I am not yet finished speaking with you, Lady Evelina, and I do not intend to let you disappear back into that corner with your sisters simply because society expects it of me." Across the room, Charlotte and Margaret exchanged a look of pure astonishment, while Lady Constance's fan snapped shut with a sound sharp enough to cut through the music itself. Evelina stood frozen in the center of the ballroom floor, her hand still held firmly in the Duke's, painfully aware that whatever she had started with a single dare, it was no longer entirely within her control. "Your Grace," she tried again, softer this time. "People are staring. People are always staring at me," he said. "It changes nothing about what I choose to do." A footman passed nearby carrying a tray of drinks, and for a moment, the ordinary sound of the party continued around them, as though the rest of the world had not noticed that the most feared man in London was refusing to let go of a young woman he had met only minutes before. Evelina glanced toward the doors, half expecting her mother to appear and pull her away before the scandal could grow any larger, but no one moved to interrupt them. "If you truly do not wish for rumors," the Duke said, finally loosening his grip enough to step back half a pace, though he did not release her hand entirely, "then perhaps you ought not to have crossed the room to speak to me in the first place. It is a little late to worry about what people will say." "I did not think that far ahead," Evelina admitted. "Few people do, when they act on a dare," he said, and there was no mockery in his voice, only a strange kind of understanding, as though he recognized something of himself in her impulsive courage. "But I find I am grateful you did not think it through. It has been a long time since anyone in this room looked at me as anything other than a name to fear." The honesty in his words surprised her more than anything else that evening. She studied his face, searching for the cruelty the rumors had promised her, the coldness that was supposed to explain why grown men lowered their voices when they spoke of him. She found none of it. Instead, she saw something closer to loneliness, carefully hidden behind a mask that had clearly taken years to perfect. Lady Evelina, he said quietly, releasing her hand at last, though his eyes stayed fixed on hers. I do not know what tomorrow will bring, or what this ballroom will say about tonight by morning, but I find that I have no wish for this to be the only conversation we ever have. Before she could answer, the orchestra struck up a new song, and the crowd around them began to move again, filling the space that had opened around the two of them like water rushing back into a hollow. Evelina curtsied once more, her mind spinning, and turned to walk back toward her sisters, feeling every eye in the ballroom follow her the entire way. Whatever she had started with a single reckless dare, she understood now that it was only the beginning. By morning, the story had already traveled farther than Evelina could have imagined. She woke to the sound of her mother's voice rising sharply from the breakfast room, followed by the rustle of a newspaper being set down too hard on the table. The whole of London is talking about it, her mother said, as Evelina entered, still tying the ribbon of her morning gown. The Duke of Ravensmore danced with you, twice, some say, though I know for certain it was only once. He would not let go of your hand in front of 300 guests. It was not quite 300, Evelina said, taking her seat, though her stomach tightened at the memory. That is not the point, her mother said, pressing a hand to her chest as though the very idea required physical steadying. Do you understand what this means? Men do not simply forget a duke's attention. Either it becomes something, or it becomes a scandal that follows you for years. Charlotte, seated across the table with a barely concealed grin, leaned forward. I told you it was a good dare. It was a dangerous dare, their mother snapped, though her eyes had already begun to soften with something closer to hope than anger. But perhaps not an unfortunate one. Evelina said nothing, staring down at the food she had no appetite for. She kept replaying the moment his hand had refused to release hers, the low certainty in his voice when he said he had no wish for their conversation to end. It should have frightened her more than it did. Instead, she found herself wondering when she might see him again, and the wondering unsettled her almost as much as the memory itself. She did not have to wonder long. That afternoon, a carriage bearing an unfamiliar crest arrived outside the Ashworth townhouse, and a footman delivered a folded letter directly into her hands, refusing to leave it with the housekeeper as custom might have allowed. Evelina broke the seal with fingers that were not entirely steady. The handwriting was firm, controlled, without a single wasted word. Lady Evelina, you have caused considerable talk in a city that rarely finds anything worth talking about beyond its own reflection. I find I do not regret it. I would be obliged if you and your family would join me at the Hartwell Garden reception this coming Thursday. I understand it is customary to ask such things through more proper channels, involving your mother and several tedious formalities, but I have never had much patience for customary things. Ravensmore. She read it 3 times before she realized she was smiling. When she showed the letter to her mother, the older woman's reaction was somewhere between delight and panic, torn between the thrill of a duke's personal attention and the fear of what would happen should the arrangement fall apart in front of society's watchful eyes. You must go, her mother said firmly. Whatever this becomes, you cannot refuse a duke's invitation, not after what happened last night. Thursday arrived faster than Evelina expected. The Hartwell Gardens were already crowded with guests by the time the Ashworth carriage pulled up, lanterns strung between the trees casting a warm golden light over rows of roses and neatly trimmed hedges. Evelina spotted the Duke almost immediately, standing near a stone fountain, once again separated from the rest of the gathering by that same invisible distance no one dared to cross. This time, however, the moment he saw her arrive, he crossed the distance himself. Lady Evelina, he said, offering a bow that drew immediate attention from every guest within sight. I was beginning to think you might not come. I nearly did not, she admitted. My mother spent 2 days convincing me it was the correct decision. And what convinced you? She considered the question seriously before answering. Curiosity, mostly. I wanted to know if the man from the ballroom was real, or if I had simply imagined him because the room was too warm and the punch too strong. That surprised sound left him again, the almost laugh she was beginning to recognize as rare and genuine. I assure you, I am entirely real, however inconvenient that may prove for both of us. They walked together along the garden path, trailed at a respectful distance by curious eyes that never quite left them alone. Evelina noticed Lady Constance among the guests, dressed in deep green silk, watching their every step with an expression carefully arranged into polite interest, though nothing about her eyes matched the calm of her smile. You have an admirer who does not appear pleased by my company, Evelina said quietly. The Duke followed her gaze, and something in his expression hardened briefly, before smoothing over again. Lady Constance has decided for 2 years now that she is destined to become the next Duchess of Ravensmore. I have never given her reason to believe such a thing, though that has not discouraged her. She looks as though she disagrees with your assessment. She looks, he said, as though she has already decided you are an obstacle. I would advise caution around her, Lady Evelina. She is not a woman who accepts disappointment gracefully. Evelina filed the warning away, though at the time it seemed a distant concern compared to the strange, quiet pleasure of walking beside a man who spoke to her as an equal rather than a decoration. They spent nearly an hour together, wandering through the garden paths, discussing everything from poetry to the ridiculousness of certain society customs, and Evelina found herself laughing more freely than she had in months. "May I ask you something honest?" she said eventually, as they paused near a bench shaded by an old oak tree. "I would expect nothing less from you. Why me? There are dozens of women in London who would have crossed that ballroom gladly, given the chance. Women with better connections, better fortunes, better reputations for elegance. Why does it matter that I was the one who dared to approach you?" The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the fountain before returning to her face. "Because every other woman in that room who might have approached me would have done so calculating what she stood to gain. You approached me because you were tired of being told what you could not do. That is not the same thing at all. That is a rather generous reading of a foolish dare." "Perhaps," he said, "or perhaps I simply recognize honesty when it is standing directly in front of me, since it happens so rarely in my presence." Before Evelina could respond, a shadow fell across the path, and Lady Constance appeared beside them with a smile stretched too wide to be entirely sincere. "Your Grace, Lady Evelina, how charming to find you both wandering so far from the other guests. One might almost think you were avoiding company altogether." "We were simply enjoying the gardens," Evelina said carefully. "Of course," Lady Constance said, her eyes flicking briefly over Evelina's gown, her hair, her posture, cataloging every detail with practiced precision. "Though I imagine the gardens are far more interesting in such distinguished company. Tell me, Lady Evelina, how does your family find themselves suddenly so fortunate in society's eyes? I do not recall the Ashworth name being mentioned quite so often before this week." The comment was delivered with a smile, but the insult beneath it was unmistakable. Evelina felt heat rise in her cheeks, though she forced her expression to remain calm. Beside her, the Duke's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, his jaw tightening. "Lady Constance," he said, his voice cool enough to cut through the warm evening air, "if you have something to say to Lady Evelina, I would suggest saying it plainly, rather than dressing it in false pleasantries. It suits neither your intelligence nor hers to pretend otherwise." Lady Constance's smile faltered for the briefest instant before recovering. "Of course, Your Grace, I meant nothing by it beyond simple curiosity." She departed with a rustle of green silk, leaving behind a silence that Evelina did not know how to fill. She glanced up at the Duke, expecting to see irritation, and instead found something closer to quiet resolve. "You need not defend me," she said. "I am capable of answering for myself." "I have no doubt of that," he said. "But I have watched that woman circle this city for 2 years, waiting for an opportunity to claim a title she believes she is owed. I will not stand by while she attempts to use you as a stepping stone toward that ambition." The protectiveness in his voice startled her, warm and unfamiliar, entirely unlike anything she had expected from the man the whole of London feared. As the evening wore on and the lanterns burned lower in the trees, Evelina found herself walking closer to his side than propriety strictly allowed, aware that whatever had begun with a single dare in a crowded ballroom, it had already grown into something neither of them seemed inclined to stop. "May I ask you something in return?" the Duke said, as they turned onto a quieter path lined with white roses, the noise of the party fading behind them. "You may. Are you afraid of me? Truthfully. Not the answer you believe is polite." Evelina considered the question carefully, aware that he deserved an honest answer after giving her one himself. "I was, before the ballroom. Everyone speaks of you as though you were carved from stone, incapable of warmth. But I do not think that is true anymore." "And what do you think is true?" "I think," she said slowly, "that something happened to you once that taught you it was safer to be feared than to be known. I think the coldness is armor, not nature." He stopped walking entirely, turning to face her fully for the first time that evening. The lantern light caught the sharp planes of his face, and for a moment his expression was unguarded in a way she had not yet seen, something raw and unpracticed beneath the composure he wore like a second skin. "You are more perceptive than is comfortable, Lady Evelina. Is that a compliment or a complaint?" "I have not yet decided," he said, though the faint curve of his mouth suggested it leaned closer to the former. Perhaps both. They resumed walking, and he told her, briefly and without much detail, of a betrothal from years earlier, one that had ended badly enough that he had closed himself off from society rather than risk being made a fool of twice. He did not linger on the particulars, and Evelina did not press him, sensing that trust was something that had to be earned slowly, not demanded all at once. Still, the fact that he told her anything at all felt significant, a door left slightly open rather than firmly shut. "Most men in your position would never admit such a thing," she said quietly. "Most men in my position have never met a woman who crossed an entire ballroom simply because she was tired of being underestimated," he replied. "You make honesty feel less dangerous than I remember it being." By the time the Ashworth carriage was called for departure, the sky above the garden had turned the deep violet of late evening, and Evelina's mother was practically vibrating with barely restrained excitement as they climbed inside. Charlotte and Margaret bombarded her with questions the moment the carriage door closed, demanding every detail of what had been said, how long they had walked together, whether he had smiled even once. Evelina answered what she could, though she found herself keeping certain moments private, tucked away like something too fragile to be handled by other people's curious hands. The confession about his broken betrothal, the quiet vulnerability in his voice when he admitted she made honesty feel less dangerous, these things felt like hers alone to keep, at least for now. "You are quiet," Margaret said, studying her sister's face in the dim carriage light. "You have that look again, the one you get when you are thinking too hard about something you do not want to share." "I am simply tired," Evelina said, though it was only half true. Charlotte was not fooled. "You like him, truly like him, not simply the excitement of being noticed by a duke." Evelina did not answer immediately, watching the passing lamplight flicker across the carriage window instead. She thought of the way his voice had softened when he spoke of honesty, the way his guarded expression had cracked open just enough to let her glimpse the man beneath the title. It frightened her, how quickly she had come to care what he thought of her, how eagerly she found herself hoping their next meeting would come soon. "I do not know what I feel yet," she admitted finally, "only that I do not wish to stop finding out." Her mother, seated across from them, reached over and squeezed her hand. Her earlier anxiety softened now into something gentler. "Whatever this becomes, my dear, you have already done something no other woman in London managed to do. You made the Duke of Ravensmore smile in public. That alone will be spoken of for weeks." As the carriage rolled through the darkened streets of London, Evelina looked back once toward the glowing lanterns of the Hartwell Gardens, already shrinking into the distance, and found herself already anticipating when she might see him again. She did not yet know that Lady Constance had watched their entire walk through the roses with far more attention than a polite guest should, or that the seeds of a much larger scandal were already being planted in the fertile ground of London's endless appetite for gossip. The knock at the Ashworth door came far too early for a social call, and Evelina knew before she even reached the hallway that something was wrong. Her mother stood frozen near the entrance, a folded news sheet trembling in her hands, her face drained of color. "What is it?" Evelina asked, though a cold dread was already settling in her stomach. Her mother did not answer at first, simply handed her the paper. Evelina scanned the page, and her breath caught somewhere between her chest and her throat. There, printed in bold ink for all of London to read, was a story claiming that Lady Evelina Ashworth had deliberately orchestrated her introduction to the Duke of Ravensmore as part of a calculated scheme to secure his fortune, that her family had been quietly drowning in debt for years, and had sent their youngest daughter to entrap a wealthy title before their financial ruin became public knowledge. None of it was true, not a single word. But truth, Evelina was quickly learning, mattered very little once a story had begun to spread. Who would write such a thing, she asked, though even as the words left her mouth, she already suspected the answer. "It does not say," her mother replied, sinking into a nearby chair, "but it does not need to say. Half of London will believe it regardless of the source." By afternoon, the whispers had already reached a fever pitch. Evelina accompanied her mother to a modiste's shop for a fitting that had been arranged weeks earlier, and the moment they entered, conversation among the other patrons stopped entirely, replaced by pointed glances and poorly concealed murmurs. A woman near the window leaned toward her companion and said, just loudly enough to be heard, that some families would stoop to any depth to climb above their station. Evelina held her chin high and said nothing, though the humiliation burned hot beneath her composed expression. She thought of the Duke, of the quiet honesty they had shared in the garden only days before, and wondered whether he had already heard the rumors, whether he believed even a fraction of what was being said about her. She did not have to wonder long. That evening a letter arrived, though this time the handwriting was less certain than before, the ink slightly smudged as though written in haste. Lady Evelina, I have heard the stories circulating through the city, and I want you to know plainly that I do not believe a word of them. I recognize manufactured scandal when I see it, having survived enough of my own. However, I must ask you to understand something about the world we live in. My name carries weight, and that weight falls heavily on anyone standing beside me when the wind turns against us. I will not allow you to be destroyed for the crime of daring to speak with me honestly. Whatever comes next, know that this is not your doing. Ravensmore. The letter should have comforted her, and in part it did, but beneath the reassurance she sensed something else, a warning perhaps, or the beginning of a retreat. She read it 3 times, searching for certainty in his words, and found instead a careful distance that had not existed in the garden. The following days brought no relief. Wherever Evelina went, the rumors followed, growing more elaborate with each retelling. By the end of the week, the story had transformed from a simple accusation of fortune hunting into something far more damaging, whispers that suggested the Ashworth family had arranged compromising circumstances to force the Duke's hand entirely, that Evelina herself had lured him away from the ballroom with calculated intention rather than innocent courage. At the milliner's shop 2 days later, Evelina encountered Lady Constance directly for the first time since the rumors had begun. The other woman stood near a display of feathered bonnets, dressed immaculately as always, and her smile upon seeing Evelina was sharp enough to draw blood. "Lady Evelina," she said, her voice carrying just enough for the other patrons to hear. "How brave of you to still show your face about town, given everything being said." "I have done nothing to be ashamed of," Evelina replied, keeping her voice level despite the anger rising in her chest. "Of course not," Lady Constance said, her tone dripping with false sympathy. "Though I do wonder how a family in such precarious financial circumstances managed to secure invitations to quite so many exclusive events this season. Fortune does seem to favor the desperate, does it not?" "I do not know what you have heard," Evelina said carefully, "but my family's circumstances are none of your concern, and neither is my acquaintance with the Duke." "Acquaintance," Lady Constance repeated, savoring the word, as though it amused her greatly. "Is that what we are calling it now? How charmingly modest of you. Tell me, does the Duke know how thoroughly you have planned this little campaign, or does he still believe it was all innocent chance?" Evelina's hands curled into fists at her sides, though she forced herself to remain composed. "I did not come here to trade insults with you, Lady Constance. I came to purchase a bonnet." "Of course you did," Lady Constance said, stepping closer, her voice dropping lower, meant only for Evelina's ears now. "Let me offer you a piece of honest advice, since you seem so fond of honesty. Walk away from him now, quietly, before this becomes something far worse than gossip. I have spent 2 years building the connections necessary to become his Duchess, and I do not intend to watch some clever nobody from an unremarkable family steal what I have worked so carefully to secure. You will not win this, Lady Evelina, I promise you that." The threat, delivered with such calm precision, sent a chill through Evelina that lingered long after she left the shop, the bonnet forgotten entirely. She said nothing of the encounter to her mother or sisters that evening, unwilling to add further worry to a household already strained thin by scandal, but the words repeated themselves in her mind long into the night, a quiet, persistent warning she could not shake. Charlotte and Margaret, once so delighted by the success of their dare, now wore matching expressions of guilt whenever the subject arose. It was Charlotte who finally broke the uneasy silence between them one evening, finding Evelina alone in the drawing room, staring blankly at a book she had not turned a single page of in an hour. "This is our fault," Charlotte said quietly, sitting beside her sister. "We pushed you into that ballroom. We never once considered what might happen if things went wrong." "You could not have known," Evelina said, though there was little comfort in the words. "We should have," Margaret added from the doorway, her usual playfulness entirely absent. "We treated it as a game, and now you are the one paying the price for our amusement." Evelina closed her book and looked at her sisters, seeing genuine remorse in both their faces. "It is not entirely your doing. I chose to cross that room. I chose to keep speaking with him afterward. Whatever comes of this, it is my choice, as much as yours." "Perhaps," Charlotte said, "but we cannot undo what has already been said. The question now is what you intend to do about it." That question haunted Evelina long after her sisters had gone to bed. She lay awake staring at the ceiling of her room, turning the problem over and over without finding any solution that did not end in further damage to her family's name or the Duke's reputation. By morning, exhaustion had settled into a grim sort of resolve. She would withdraw, quietly, without further scandal, before the rumors could grow any larger than they already had. It was the only path she could see that did not risk dragging the Duke's name, and her family's future, into permanent ruin. Her resolve was tested sooner than expected. 3 days later, an invitation arrived for a private dinner hosted by the Duke himself, a smaller gathering than the garden reception, intended, according to the note, to allow the two families a proper opportunity to become acquainted, away from the prying eyes of the wider ton. Evelina's mother was ecstatic at the prospect, insisting it was precisely the sort of gesture that would silence the rumors once and for all, a public demonstration of the Duke's continued regard. Evelina was less certain. She dressed for the evening with a knot of anxiety tightening in her chest, uncertain whether she was walking toward salvation or further catastrophe. The Ravensmoor townhouse, when they arrived, was smaller and warmer than she had expected, lit by soft candlelight rather than the blazing chandeliers of the grander ballrooms, with only a handful of other guests present. The Duke greeted her personally at the door, his expression carefully composed, though Evelina noticed the tension in his shoulders that had not been there in the garden. "Lady Evelina, I am glad you came." "I nearly did not," she admitted honestly, as they moved toward the drawing room. "I would not have blamed you," he said. "The city has not been kind to you this week." "No," she agreed, "it has not." Dinner proceeded with careful, polite conversation, the Duke's aunt presiding as hostess with practiced grace, steering discussion away from anything too pointed. It was only afterward, when the guests retired to the drawing room, and the Duke drew Evelina aside near a window overlooking the darkened garden, that the true purpose of the evening became clear. "I have made inquiries," he said quietly, "into the source of the rumors. I believe I know who is responsible." Evelina's stomach tightened. "Lady Constance." "Yes," he confirmed. "One of my household staff overheard her speaking with a gossip columnist only 2 days after our walk through the Hartwell Gardens. It seems she took considerable exception to how that evening ended. What will you do?" "I have not yet decided," he admitted. "Confronting her directly risks giving the rumors more life, not less, but allowing this to continue unchecked is equally unacceptable." Evelina studied his face in the candlelight, searching for the man who had spoken so openly to her in the garden, and found him still there, though guarded now by the weight of a decision he had not yet made. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "the wisest course is for me to withdraw from your company entirely. If the connection between us ends, the rumors will have nothing left to feed upon." Something shifted sharply in his expression, a flash of something that looked almost like anger, though she understood immediately it was not directed at her. "You believe that is the solution?" "I believe it protects your name, and my family's, from further damage." "And what of what you want?" he asked, his voice lower now, more intent. "Does that factor into this calculation at all?" Evelina hesitated, unable to answer immediately, and in that hesitation, he seemed to find something he needed. He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him despite the coolness of the room. "I did not spend 2 years avoiding every ballroom in London, only to surrender the first honest connection I have found the moment it becomes difficult," he said. "I have survived worse scandals than this one, Lady Evelina. I do not intend to let Lady Constance's jealousy dictate the course of my life." "This is not only about your life," Evelina said, her voice unsteady. "My sister's prospects, my family's reputation, all of it hangs in the balance now." "Then we shall protect all of it together," he said. "But I will not accept your withdrawal as the answer, not without a fight." Before Evelina could respond, the drawing room door opened, and the Duke's aunt appeared, announcing that the other guests were preparing to depart. The moment dissolved, but the intensity of it lingered between them, as Evelina gathered her things and prepared to leave, uncertain whether his words had settled her fears or deepened them entirely. Outside, as the Ashworth carriage pulled away from the townhouse, she caught one last glimpse of him standing in the doorway, watching her leave with an expression she could not quite name, somewhere between determination and something far more vulnerable than a man in his position should ever allow himself to show. Inside the carriage, her mother could not stop talking about the evening, praising the elegance of the townhouse, the warmth of the Duke's aunt, the unmistakable regard in his eyes whenever he looked toward Evelina across the room. Evelina listened with only half her attention, her mind still caught on the encounter with Lady Constance days earlier, on the cold certainty in that woman's voice when she promised that Evelina would not win. "You are troubled," her mother said eventually, noticing her daughter's silence. "What is it?" Evelina considered keeping the encounter to herself, but exhaustion won out over caution. She recounted the conversation at the milliner's shop in careful detail, watching her mother's face grow pale with each word. "That woman is dangerous," her mother said when Evelina finished. "I have heard stories of what she did to another young lady 2 seasons ago. A girl who briefly caught the attention of a viscount Lady Constance had set her sights upon. The girl's family left London entirely within the month, their reputation in tatters. Do you believe she would go so far?" "I believe," her mother said grimly, "that we have already seen how far she is willing to go. The rumors printed this week did not invent themselves." The carriage fell quiet after that, each of them lost in private worry as the familiar streets of London passed by outside the window. Evelina thought of the Duke's words in the drawing room, his refusal to accept her withdrawal, his insistence that they face the scandal together rather than apart. Part of her wanted desperately to believe that such loyalty could withstand whatever Lady Constance still had planned. Another part of her, the part shaped by a lifetime of being told to expect disappointment, feared that this particular battle was one neither of them could fully control. When they arrived home, Evelina retreated to her room rather than joining her sisters for their usual evening conversation, needing solitude to sort through the tangle of fear and hope twisting inside her chest. She sat by the window for a long while, watching the gas lamps flicker along the quiet street below, replaying every moment of the evening, from the warmth of the Duke's welcome to the sharp intensity in his voice when he refused to let her go. She did not yet know what the coming weeks would bring, whether the Duke's determination would prove strong enough to withstand Lady Constance's campaign, or whether her own resolve to protect her family would ultimately force her hand regardless of what he wanted. But as she finally climbed into bed, exhausted from a day that had asked far more of her than any ballroom dare ever could, one thought remained clear above all the uncertainty. Whatever happened next, she would not face it as a passive bystander in her own story. She had crossed that ballroom once already, against every expectation placed upon her, and she was not yet ready to retreat simply because the path ahead had grown difficult. A week passed with no new scandal in the papers, though the whispers had not entirely died away. The Duke had apparently begun making quiet inquiries of his own, and word had spread through certain circles that he would not tolerate any further attacks on the Ashworth family's name. Whether it was his influence or simple exhaustion of the story, the rumors slowed enough that Evelina could walk through the market without every head turning to whisper behind gloved hands. It was during this uneasy calm that a second letter arrived, this one inviting the entire Ashworth family to a private gathering in the gardens behind the Ravensmoor townhouse, a smaller and far more intimate affair than the grand reception at Hartwell. Evelina's mother accepted before Evelina had even finished reading the invitation aloud. The gardens, when they arrived, were nothing like the vast, manicured grounds of Hartwell. These were older, wilder in places, with ivy climbing stone walls and a small pond reflecting the late afternoon sun. The Duke greeted them personally, and this time there was no careful distance between them, no performance for an audience of strangers. Only a handful of guests had been invited, close family friends of the Ravensmoor household, and the atmosphere felt unusually relaxed for a gathering that included a Duke. "You seem different today," Evelina observed, as they walked together along the edge of the pond while her mother and sisters admired a nearby rose arbor with the Duke's aunt. "Different how?" "Less guarded, as though you have set something down that you usually carry." He was quiet for a moment, watching the ripples spread across the water's surface where a fish had broken through. "This garden belonged to my mother," he said finally. "She died when I was 12, and my father closed most of the house afterward, unable to bear the memories. I kept this section maintained, though I rarely allow guests here. It felt important somehow that you see it." The weight of what he was telling her settled slowly into place. This was not simply a garden. It was a piece of himself he had chosen to share, deliberately, in a way he had shared nothing else since the ballroom. "Thank you for trusting me with it," she said quietly. She looked around at the small garden more carefully now, noticing details she had missed at first glance. A stone bench worn smooth by years of sitting, a small carved marker half hidden beneath a climbing vine that she suspected marked where his mother's favorite tree had once stood. There was such careful tenderness in how the space had been kept, untouched by the formal grandeur of the rest of the estate, that Evelina understood immediately why he had chosen to bring her here, rather than the grander reception rooms where he entertained the wider ton. "Does anyone else know about this place?" she asked. "My aunt, of course. A handful of staff who have served the family long enough to remember my mother themselves. Beyond that, very few." He paused, glancing toward the small stone bench. "She used to read to me here, in the summers, before she grew too ill to manage the walk from the house. I have always thought it strange, how clearly I remember her voice, though I was so young when she died." "It is not strange at all," Evelina said gently. Some things settle so deeply into us that time cannot wear them away, no matter how many years pass. He looked at her then with an expression she had not yet seen from him, something quieter than admiration, closer to recognition, as though she had put into words something he had always felt but never managed to articulate himself. I find that trust comes more easily with you than it has with anyone in a very long time, he admitted, his voice low enough that it felt meant only for her. I have spent years believing that keeping people at a distance was the only way to protect myself from being hurt again. My betrothal ended not because I lacked feeling, but because I trusted too completely, and that trust was used against me in ways I still find difficult to speak of plainly. Evelina waited, sensing he needed the space to continue at his own pace rather than being pressed for details. Her name was Isabel, he said eventually. We were engaged for nearly a year. I believed, foolishly perhaps, that she loved me as I loved her. It was only after the engagement had been publicly announced that I learned she had been corresponding with another man throughout our courtship, a man with a far larger fortune who had simply taken longer to make his intentions known. When his offer finally came, she broke our engagement 3 days before the wedding, in a letter delivered by her maid rather than spoken to my face. That is a cruel way to end something, Evelina said softly. It taught me a valuable lesson, he said, though there was no bitterness in his voice now, only a tired sort of acceptance. That titles and fortunes attract a particular kind of attention, one that has very little to do with the person underneath them. After Isabel, I decided it was safer to be feared than to be sought after for the wrong reasons. Fear, at least, is honest. It does not pretend to be something else. And now? Evelina asked. Do you still believe that? He turned to look at her directly, the late sunlight catching the sincerity in his expression. Now I am not entirely certain what I believe, except that you have made it considerably more difficult to remain convinced of my own philosophy. They walked in comfortable silence for a while after that, the earlier tension of the season's scandal feeling distant beneath the peaceful hush of the old garden. Evelina found herself sharing pieces of her own life in return, the quiet frustration of being the youngest of 3 sisters, always compared, always slightly overlooked in favor of Charlotte's wit or Margaret's beauty, the years spent retreating into books because the pages never made her feel invisible the way ballrooms often did. You speak of your sisters as though their brightness dimmed yours, he said thoughtfully, but I have watched Charlotte and Margaret this afternoon, and neither of them commands a room the way you did that first night, simply by refusing to be afraid. Wit and beauty are common enough in London ballrooms. Courage of the sort you showed is not. You make it sound far braver than it felt at the time, Evelina said. Mostly I simply did not wish to be laughed at for backing down from a dare. Perhaps, he said, but I have known a great many men who called themselves brave, and would never have crossed that room. Courage is rarely as dramatic as people imagine. Usually it looks exactly like what you did. One small, frightened step followed by another, until the distance is somehow crossed. Evelina considered this, turning the thought over as they continued along the path bordering the pond. It occurred to her that no one, not her sisters, not her mother, not any partner she had danced with in prior seasons, had ever spoken to her with such careful attention to what she actually said, rather than simply waiting for their turn to speak. There was a stillness to the Duke's attention that she had not encountered before, a willingness to sit with her words rather than rush past them. I do not think you are the sort of woman anyone could overlook for long, the Duke said, when she finished explaining the rest of her childhood, the quiet years spent in libraries while her sisters attended dancing lessons. It simply took the right room, and the right dare to prove it. Their conversation was interrupted eventually by Evelina's mother calling them back toward the rose arbor for tea, and Evelina found herself seated beside the Duke's aunt, a warm, sharp-eyed woman named Lady Harriet who watched the exchange between her nephew and Evelina with obvious approval. He has not brought anyone to this garden in years, Lady Harriet said quietly, once the Duke had stepped away briefly to attend to another guest. Not since his mother passed. I confess I did not expect to see the day. I am honored then, Evelina said, though the weight of the gesture had already settled deeply upon her. Honored is the correct word, Lady Harriet agreed. My nephew has spent years convincing everyone, myself included at times, that he no longer feels things deeply. It was never true, only convenient for him to let people believe it. Whatever you have done, Lady Evelina, you have reminded him that he is still capable of hope. I would not take that lightly, if I were you. The remainder of the afternoon passed in pleasant, unremarkable conversation among the small gathering of guests, tea and light conversation about the season's events. Though Evelina found her attention returning again and again to the Duke across the garden, to the easy warmth in his manner that seemed entirely new, unfamiliar even to those who had known him for years. But something had shifted between them in that quiet corner of the garden, a deepening of trust that felt sturdier than the fragile excitement of their first meeting. As the Ashworth family prepared to depart at dusk, the Duke walked Evelina to the carriage himself, away from the others for a brief private moment. "I meant what I said in the drawing room," he told her quietly. "I do not intend to let Lady Constance or anyone else dictate what happens between us. Whatever comes next, I would ask that you trust me to face it alongside you, rather than retreating to protect me from consequences I have chosen willingly." "That is a difficult thing to ask," Evelina said honestly. "My instinct has always been to disappear quietly rather than cause further trouble." "I know," he said, "which is precisely why I am asking it of you directly, rather than assuming you would simply understand." She looked up at him, at the sincerity plain across his face, so different from the cold, unreachable figure the whole of London believed him to be. "Then I will try," she said, "though I cannot promise it will be easy." "Nothing worth having usually is," he replied, and for the first time since the ballroom, he smiled at her fully, an expression so unguarded and unexpected that it transformed his entire face, stripping away years of careful distance in a single moment. "You should smile more often," Evelina said, before she could stop herself. "It suits you far better than the frown the whole of London has come to expect. Perhaps I have simply lacked sufficient reason, until recently." Behind them, her mother's voice called out cheerfully, urging Charlotte and Margaret to hurry along before the light faded entirely, and the moment between them stretched thin, pulled taut by the ordinary demands of departure. Still, neither of them moved to end it quickly. The Duke reached for her hand one final time, pressing a brief, formal kiss against her gloved knuckles that lingered a fraction longer than strict etiquette required. "Until we meet again, Lady Evelina. Until then, Your Grace." She climbed into the carriage beside her sisters, who exchanged knowing looks the moment the door closed, though neither of them teased her the way they might have a week earlier. Something in her expression must have warned them that this had grown beyond the reach of playful sisterly mockery, into territory too fragile and too important to treat lightly. Her mother, seated across from them, watched the Ravensmoor townhouse recede into the distance, with an expression of quiet, cautious satisfaction. "He looks at you the way your father used to look at me," she said softly, almost to herself. I had forgotten what that particular kind of attention looked like on a man's face. Evelina said nothing, though the words settled warmly somewhere beneath her ribs, alongside the memory of his hand around hers, the low certainty in his voice when he asked her to trust him. Whatever difficulties still lay ahead, whatever Lady Constance might yet attempt, she found herself unwilling to retreat from this, unwilling to let fear dictate her choices the way it once had, before a single reckless dare had carried her across a crowded ballroom floor and changed the entire shape of her future. As the carriage pulled away and the Ravensmoor gardens disappeared into the evening light, Evelina allowed herself, for the first time since the scandal began, to feel something close to hope. She did not yet know that Lady Constance, having failed to separate them through gossip alone, had already begun planning something far more deliberate, a scheme designed not merely to damage Evelina's reputation, but to end the connection between them permanently, regardless of the cost to anyone standing in her way. The scandal sheet arrived on a Tuesday morning, and this time there was no mistaking the source or the intent behind it. Evelina's mother found it first, left folded on the breakfast table by a maid who had not yet learned to recognize which deliveries brought disaster into the household. The headline alone was enough to send a wave of nausea through Evelina's stomach. A calculated conquest, how the Ashworth family trapped a duke. The article that followed was far more detailed than the vague rumors of the previous weeks, filled with specific claims that could only have come from someone close to the family, or someone skilled enough to fabricate convincing detail. It alleged that Evelina had deliberately learned the Duke's habits and social patterns weeks before the ballroom encounter, that her sister's dare had been staged rather than spontaneous, an elaborate performance designed to appear innocent while securing exactly the outcome the family desired. It claimed further that private letters between Evelina and the Duke had been intercepted, revealing a scheme to force a hasty engagement through manufactured intimacy, though no actual letters were quoted, only vague and damning insinuation. "This is a lie," Evelina said, her hands trembling as she set the paper down. "Every word of it." "It does not matter whether it is true," her mother said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "It matters whether people believe it. And after this, Evelina, I fear a great many people will." The consequences arrived swiftly. By that afternoon, two families who had previously extended invitations for the coming week sent quiet, carefully worded notes rescinding them. By evening, Charlotte returned from a visit to a childhood friend in tears, having been turned away at the door with excuse so thin it barely qualified as polite. The Ashworth name, once simply unremarkable in London society, had become something people wished to distance themselves from entirely. Evelina spent that night writing and rewriting a letter to the Duke, uncertain what she intended to say. Part of her wanted to warn him, to give him the chance to distance himself before the scandal could reach further into his own reputation. Another part of her, quieter and more selfish, wanted only to hear him say again that he did not believe a word of it, that nothing had changed between them. In the end, she sent nothing, and it was he who arrived at her door the following morning, his expression grim in a way she had not seen since the earliest days of their acquaintance. "I assume you have seen it," he said, once they were alone in the drawing room, her mother having reluctantly agreed to give them a few private minutes. "The whole of London has seen it," Evelina said. "I am told several families have already withdrawn their invitations." "I know," he said. "I have spent the morning attempting to trace its origin, though I already suspect the answer. Lady Constance. Yes. Though this time, she has been careful enough to leave no direct evidence connecting her to the story. Whoever wrote it protected their source well." Evelina sank into a chair, exhaustion finally catching up with the fear she had been holding at bay since the previous morning. "I do not know how to fight something with no clear author, no way to prove its falsehood beyond simply denying it, which only ever seems to make people believe it more." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, watching her with an expression that mixed anger and helplessness in equal measure, emotions she suspected he rarely allowed himself to feel so openly. "There is a way," he said finally, "though it requires a public confrontation I had hoped to avoid, for your sake as much as my own." "What do you mean?" "Lady Wexford is hosting a ball in 3 days. Nearly every family of consequence in London will be present, including Lady Constance herself. If I address the rumors directly, publicly, in front of the entire assembly, it will be far more difficult for anyone to continue spreading them afterward." "That is a considerable risk," Evelina said. "If it goes wrong, if you cannot prove what you suspect, the damage could be far worse than what already exists." "I am aware," he said, "but allowing this to continue unchecked is not an option I am willing to accept. I told you once that I would not let Lady Constance dictate the course of this connection between us. I meant it." Evelina studied his face, searching for hesitation and finding none. Whatever fear he carried about the confrontation ahead, he had already decided the cost was worth paying. "And if it does not work, if the crowd does not believe you, or worse, if it only confirms their suspicions, then we shall face that outcome together, as I asked of you before," he said. "But I would rather fail having tried, than succeed at nothing by remaining silent." The 3 days leading up to the Wexford ball passed in a haze of anxious preparation. Evelina's mother alternated between fierce determination and quiet despair, uncertain whether attending the ball was an act of courage or a foolish invitation for further humiliation. Charlotte and Margaret, subdued since the scandal's escalation, spent the days researching everything they could learn about Lady Constance's movements, hoping to uncover some thread of evidence that might strengthen the Duke's confrontation. It was Margaret, surprisingly, who found the first real clue, having befriended a maid who had once worked briefly in the Fenwick household before seeking employment elsewhere. The maid, still bitter over her dismissal months earlier under circumstances she considered unjust, spoke freely of overhearing Lady Constance dictating letters to a gossip columnist known throughout London for his willingness to print scandal for the right price, always careful never to name his sources directly. "It is not proof," Margaret admitted, relaying the information to Evelina and the Duke when he called the following day, "but it is a place to begin." The Duke's expression sharpened with quiet intensity. "It is enough. I know the columnist in question. He has printed enough falsehoods over the years that several families have grievances against him. If I can convince even one of them to speak publicly at the ball, it may be sufficient to shift the crowd's sympathy." The plan, fragile as it was, gave Evelina something to hold on to beyond helpless dread. Still, as the evening of the ball approached, her nerves grew steadily worse. The memory of that first triumphant walk across the ballroom floor, now shadowed by the knowledge of how quickly triumph could curdle into catastrophe. On the night itself, the Wexford townhouse blazed with light, every window glowing against the darkness. Carriages lined up along the street for what felt like an impossible distance. Evelina descended from the Ashworth carriage on unsteady legs, her mother gripping her hand tightly, Charlotte and Margaret flanking her on either side like guards prepared for battle. The moment they entered the ballroom, the effect was immediate and unmistakable. Conversation dimmed. Heads turned, Evelina felt the weight of dozens of curious, judgmental stares settling upon her, far heavier than the attention she had drawn the night of the original dare. This time, the interest was not admiration but suspicion, the crowd already primed by days of scandal to view her with distrust. She searched the room for the Duke and found him near the far end of the ballroom, deep in quiet conversation with a gentleman she did not recognize. He caught her eye across the crowded room, and something in his expression steadied her, a silent promise that whatever happened next, she would not face it alone. Lady Constance appeared soon after, resplendent in deep crimson silk, moving through the crowd with the easy confidence of a woman who believed she had already won. She approached Evelina directly, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Lady Evelina," she said, loud enough for those nearby to hear clearly. "How brave of you to show your face here tonight, given everything the papers have revealed this week." "The papers have revealed nothing but fabrication," Evelina said, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the trembling in her hands. "Have they?" Lady Constance's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "How strange, then, that so many details align so precisely with what I understand to be true of your family's circumstances." "Careful, Lady Constance," came a voice from behind them, low and cutting through the ballroom's murmur like a blade. The Duke had crossed the room without Evelina noticing, and now stood beside her, his expression carved from the same cold stillness she remembered from their very first meeting, though this time the coldness was aimed entirely at someone else. "You are treading very close to a confession." The crowd around them fell silent, sensing the shift in the air, the promise of a confrontation too significant to miss. Lady Constance's smile faltered for the briefest instant before recovering into something more brittle. "I do not know what you mean, Your Grace." "I believe you do," he said, raising his voice now, deliberately, so that it carried across the increasingly attentive ballroom. "I have spent the better part of this week tracing the origin of the story printed in Tuesday's papers. It was not difficult, once I knew where to look. A columnist with a long history of printing falsehoods for coin, and a woman with considerable motive to see Lady Evelina's reputation destroyed." Whispers erupted through the crowd, spreading outward like ripples across still water. Lady Constance's composure cracked further, her hand tightening around her fan until her knuckles whitened. "This is absurd," she said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "You have no proof of any such accusation." "I have a witness," the Duke said, and gestured toward the edge of the crowd, where a nervous young man Evelina did not recognize stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable beneath the sudden weight of attention. "Mr. Halloway here has confirmed, quite willingly, once I explained the damage his silence was causing an innocent family, that he received payment from you directly for the story published this week. He has agreed to state as much publicly, should it become necessary." The ballroom erupted into a storm of scandalized murmuring, every eye now fixed upon Lady Constance rather than Evelina. Her face had gone pale beneath her rouge, her earlier triumph collapsing entirely under the weight of public exposure. She opened her mouth as though to deny it further, then closed it again, seeming to recognize for the first time that the crowd's sympathy had shifted irrevocably away from her. "You will not deny it further?" The Duke pressed, his voice quiet now, though it carried easily through the hushed ballroom. Lady Constance's eyes darted around the room, searching for some ally among the assembled guests, some sympathetic face that might rescue her from the collapsing weight of the moment. She found none. Even those who had eagerly repeated the scandal only days earlier now watched her with the same cold judgment they had briefly aimed at Evelina, the fickle nature of society's attention shifting as swiftly as wind changing direction. "I did what any woman in my position would have done," she said finally, her voice tight and defensive, stripped of its earlier confident polish. "I have waited 2 years for your regard, Your Grace. 2 years of careful attention, of proving myself worthy of your name, only to watch you hand it to a girl who crossed a ballroom on nothing more than a foolish dare. Was I meant to simply accept that quietly?" "You were meant to accept that my regard was never yours to claim," the Duke said, his tone unyielding. "I gave you no promise, no encouragement beyond ordinary courtesy. Whatever expectation you built for yourself, I bear no responsibility for it, and I certainly bear none for the lies you spread to protect it." The silence that followed was heavy enough that Evelina could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of every eye in the ballroom shifting between the Duke, Lady Constance, and herself, waiting to see how the confrontation would resolve. Lady Constance's composure finally broke entirely, her carefully arranged expression collapsing into something raw and humiliated. "You will regret this," she said, though the threat carried none of its earlier menace, weakened by the visible tremor in her voice. "Both of you." "Perhaps," the Duke said, But I would rather face whatever consequences follow honest exposure than continue allowing falsehood to dictate the life of a woman who has done nothing to deserve it. Lady Constance turned and fled the ballroom without another word, her crimson gown a sharp slash of color disappearing through the crowd, which parted for her with the particular cruelty of a society eager to distance itself from anyone newly disgraced. The murmuring that followed her departure carried an entirely different tone now, sympathy rather than suspicion, curiosity rather than condemnation, all of it aimed toward Evelina instead. Lady Wexford herself approached moments later, her expression carefully composed despite the drama that had just unfolded in her own ballroom. "Lady Evelina," she said, loud enough for those nearby to hear clearly, "I do hope you will forgive the unpleasantness that has clouded your recent weeks. It seems London owes you a considerable apology." The shift in the room was almost dizzying, guests who had avoided eye contact with Evelina only minutes earlier now offering polite nods, quiet words of sympathy, careful distancing from their own earlier participation in the gossip. Evelina accepted it all with a composure she did not entirely feel, aware that the sudden reversal of public opinion was no more substantial than the scandal that had preceded it, built on the same shifting sand of collective assumption rather than any genuine understanding of who she truly was. It was the Duke's hand finding hers amid the crowd that finally steadied her, his fingers closing around her own with the same firm certainty he had shown that very first night in the ballroom, when he had refused to let her walk away after their dance ended. "It is over," he said quietly, meant only for her. "Is it?" Evelina asked, watching the crowd continue to buzz with excited conversation around them. "It feels as though nothing has truly changed, only that the direction of everyone's judgment has shifted." "Perhaps," he admitted, "but the lie has been exposed, and your family's name has been restored. That is not nothing, Evelina." It was the first time he had used her given name without title, and the intimacy of it settled warmly beneath her ribs, despite the exhaustion of the evening. She looked up at him, at the quiet relief visible beneath his composed exterior, and felt something in her chest loosen for the first time in days. "Thank you," she said softly, "for believing me, for fighting for this, when it would have been far easier to simply let me disappear quietly, the way I had planned to. I told you once that I did not intend to let fear dictate the course of either of our lives," he said. "I meant every word." Across the ballroom, Charlotte and Margaret watched the exchange with wide, hopeful eyes, their earlier guilt over the dare finally beginning to ease into something closer to pride. Their mother dabbed carefully at her eyes with a handkerchief, overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of a week that had threatened to ruin them all. Yet even as relief spread warmly through the ballroom, Evelina could not entirely shake the memory of Lady Constance's final words, the promise of regret delivered with such raw, wounded fury. She glanced toward the doors through which the other woman had fled, and wondered, with a small, persistent unease, whether the confrontation tonight had truly ended the danger, or merely delayed it toward some reckoning still waiting to arrive. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of restored goodwill. Guests who had whispered against her only days before, now eager to secure a dance, a conversation, any small connection to the young woman who had captured a duke's unwavering loyalty. Evelina moved through it all carefully, grateful for the shift yet wary of its foundations, aware that the same crowd could turn again just as quickly if circumstances demanded it. When the Ashworth carriage finally departed the Wexford townhouse well past midnight, her mother could not stop recounting every detail of the confrontation, replaying the Duke's steady defense with obvious delight. Charlotte and Margaret sat close beside Evelina, their earlier guilt transformed into something warmer, quieter, a shared relief that the dare which had once threatened to unravel everything had instead led, however painfully, to a truth finally spoken aloud in front of the entire city. Evelina said little on the ride home, watching the darkened streets pass by outside the window, the Duke's steady grip still lingering in memory long after his hand had released hers. Whatever Lady Constance intended by her parting threat, tonight had proven something Evelina would not soon forget, that she was no longer facing London's judgment alone, and that the man beside her had chosen, deliberately and publicly, to stand exactly where she stood. Lady Constance disappeared from London society within the week, retreating to her family's country estate under the polite fiction of ill health that fooled no one who had witnessed the events of the Wexford ball. The gossip columnist who had accepted her payment issued a quiet, humiliating retraction, buried on the back page of a paper few people bothered reading that far, though the damage to his own reputation lingered far longer than the correction itself. For Evelina, the weeks that followed felt like waking from a fever, the frantic anxiety of the previous month gradually replaced by something calmer, steadier. Invitations returned to the Ashworth household in full force, and this time Evelina found herself able to attend gatherings without the constant dread of overheard whispers following her through every room. Yet even as the scandal faded from public memory, something had shifted within her that she could not quite name. The dare that had begun everything now felt impossibly distant, a reckless girl's decision made in a single dizzying moment, while the woman who had survived the weeks since felt entirely different, tempered by consequence in ways she had not expected. The Duke called on her often during this quieter period, though never again with the formal distance of their earliest meetings. Their conversations grew easier, less guarded, filled with the particular comfort of two people who had already weathered something difficult together, and found the connection between them stronger for it rather than diminished. A single letter arrived from Lady Constance during those quiet weeks, delivered without a return address, though the handwriting was unmistakable. Evelina hesitated before opening it, uncertain whether it contained further threat or some belated attempt at apology. It proved to be neither. The letter was brief, bitter in places, though beneath the bitterness Evelina detected something closer to grudging acknowledgement. "You have won," it read simply. "I do not forgive you for it, nor do I imagine you require my forgiveness. But I find I have grown tired of a battle already lost. I will not trouble you or the Duke again." Evelina showed the letter to no one, folding it away in a drawer where it would not trouble her mother's fragile peace of mind. Whatever closure it offered was imperfect, incomplete, but it was enough to finally loosen the last thread of anxious watchfulness that had lingered since the Wexford ball, the quiet fear that Lady Constance might yet attempt some final act of retribution. It was on an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon, nearly a month after the Wexford ball, that he arrived at the Ashworth townhouse unannounced, his expression carrying a seriousness Evelina had not seen since the darkest days of the scandal. "Is something wrong?" she asked immediately, alarm rising in her chest as she led him into the drawing room. "No," he said, though his hands, she noticed, were not entirely steady, an unfamiliar sight in a man whose composure rarely wavered. "Nothing is wrong. I simply find myself in need of speaking with you directly, without the careful formality that usually governs such conversations." Evelina's mother, sensing the weight of the moment, quietly excused herself and her other daughters from the room, leaving the two of them alone amid the quiet afternoon light filtering through the drawing-room windows. "You are frightening me," Evelina admitted, watching him pace a short distance before turning back to face her. "I do not mean to frighten you," he said. "I mean only to finally say plainly what I have felt for weeks now, though I have circled the subject with far too much caution for a man who claims to fear nothing." He crossed the room and took both her hands in his expression stripped entirely of the guarded distance that had once defined him to the rest of London. "Evelina, when you crossed that ballroom on a dare, I expected nothing more than a brief, forgettable conversation, another young woman curious about the reclusive Duke everyone whispered about. Instead, you gave me something I had long since convinced myself I would never have again, honesty offered freely, without calculation, without the careful maneuvering I had come to expect from everyone around me. I only asked you to dance," she said softly, though her heart was pounding fiercely against her ribs. "You did far more than that," he said. "You reminded me that I was still capable of trust, of hope, of wanting something beyond simple survival. When Lady Constance attempted to destroy that, I discovered precisely how unwilling I was to let it go without a fight. I do not intend to let it go now, either." He released one of her hands only to reach into his coat, producing a small velvet box that he opened to reveal a ring, simple and elegant, catching the afternoon light with a soft, quiet gleam. "I am not asking this because a dare brought us together, or because scandal has bound our names in the public eye," he said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability plain across his face. "I am asking because I have come to know you these past weeks, truly know you, your courage, your honesty, your fierce loyalty to the people you love. I do not wish to spend another season without you beside me. Evelina Ashworth, will you marry me?" For a long moment, Evelina could not find words at all, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his voice, by the memory of everything that had led them to this quiet drawing room, from a reckless dare to a public confrontation to this single, unguarded question. She thought of her sister's laughing challenge that first evening, of the terror and exhilaration of crossing that ballroom floor, of every moment since that had tested whether the connection between them could survive the weight of London's judgment. "Yes," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion she made no attempt to hide. "Yes, I will marry you." The relief that broke across his face was unlike anything she had seen from him before, the last remnants of careful restraint finally falling away entirely. He slid the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, then drew her into an embrace that spoke more plainly than any words could, of everything he had not yet learned to say aloud. When her mother and sisters were finally called back into the room, the celebration that followed was loud and joyful, Charlotte and Margaret embracing their sister with tears and laughter mixed together, their mother already beginning to plan the wedding before the engagement had even been formally announced to the wider ton. "I told you it was a good dare," Charlotte said, wiping at her eyes as she hugged Evelina tightly. "You did not know it would end quite like this," Evelina said, laughing despite herself. "No," Charlotte admitted, "but I always knew you were braver than anyone gave you credit for. I am only glad the rest of London finally sees it too." In the days that followed, the Duke insisted on formally calling upon Evelina's father's old friend, a magistrate who had watched over the Ashworth family's affairs since her father's passing years earlier, to ensure every proper arrangement was made with the dignity Evelina deserved, rather than the rushed haste scandal so often demanded of young couples eager to silence gossip. There would be no hurried ceremony, no whispered suggestion that the marriage had been forced by circumstance rather than chosen freely. The Duke wanted the entire city to see plainly that this union was built on nothing but genuine regard. Lady Harriet, delighted beyond measure by the news, took it upon herself to help plan the wedding details alongside Evelina's mother, the two women forming an unlikely but effective partnership over the following weeks. Evelina found herself swept along in a pleasant current of fittings and flower arrangements and careful guest lists, though she insisted, gently but firmly, that the ceremony remain small, intimate, held in the quiet chapel near the Ravensmoor estate, rather than the grand cathedral that society might have expected of a duke's wedding. "You could have anything you wished," the Duke told her one afternoon, as they walked together through the same old garden where he had first shown her his mother's memory. "The grandest wedding London has seen in a decade, if that is what would please you." "I do not want grandeur," Evelina said. "I want honesty. I want a wedding that reflects what actually happened between us, not a performance for people who spent weeks believing the worst of me." "Then it shall be exactly as you wish," he said, and there was no hesitation in his answer, only quiet certainty that her preference mattered more to him than any expectations society might place upon them. The formal announcement, when it came days later, spread through London, with none of the poisonous speed of the earlier scandal, but with genuine warmth instead, a story the whole city seemed eager to embrace. The reclusive Duke finally brought back into society by the courage of a young woman who had once dared to cross a ballroom simply because she was tired of being underestimated. Lady Constance, from whatever quiet corner of the countryside she had retreated to, sent no word of congratulations, and none was expected. Her absence from the story that followed felt fitting, a footnote to a tale that had grown into something far larger and more enduring than her jealousy had ever managed to threaten. On the day of the wedding itself, held in the small chapel near the Ravensmoor estate rather than the grand cathedral society might have expected, Evelina stood at the entrance in a gown the color of warm ivory, her sisters arranging her train with careful, tearful hands. Through the open doors, she could see the Duke waiting at the altar, his expression open and unguarded in a way that would have seemed impossible to the London that once feared him. As she walked down the aisle, past rows of familiar faces, past her mother dabbing at happy tears, past Lady Harriet smiling with quiet, satisfied pride, Evelina thought back to that first reckless walk across a crowded ballroom floor, to the dare that had changed the entire course of her life. She had crossed that room afraid, uncertain, driven by little more than stubborn pride and a refusal to be told what she could not do. She reached the altar and took the Duke's outstretched hand, finding it steady now, sure, exactly as it had been every time he refused to let her go. "I believe," he said quietly, for her ears alone, as the ceremony was about to begin, "that this is the part where I finally, formally, refuse to let you leave my side ever again." "I would not want you to," Evelina answered, smiling through the sudden warmth of tears in her own eyes. Outside the chapel windows, the English countryside stretched green and golden beneath the afternoon sun, entirely unaware of the quiet, extraordinary journey that had brought two unlikely people together, from a single dare in a crowded ballroom to a lifetime neither of them intended to face alone. What had begun as a challenge between sisters had become something far more lasting, proof that courage, however small its beginning, could change the entire shape of a life, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was simply refuse to disappear, even when the whole world seemed to expect them to. The wedding breakfast that followed the ceremony was held in the same garden that had once belonged to the Duke's mother, tables set beneath the old oak trees, ivy still climbing the weathered stone walls exactly as it had the first afternoon Evelina had walked there. Lady Harriet oversaw the arrangements with evident pride, ensuring every small detail honored both the quiet history of the space and the joy of the occasion it now celebrated. Charlotte and Margaret spent the afternoon retelling the story of the original dare to anyone who would listen, embellishing certain details with each fresh audience until the tale had grown considerably more dramatic than the truth, though no one seemed to mind the exaggeration. Evelina's mother moved among the guests with an expression of pure, unguarded happiness, accepting congratulations with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had once feared her family's ruin and now stood instead at the center of its triumph. Evelina found a quiet moment late in the afternoon to slip away from the celebration, walking alone to the small stone bench beside the pond where the Duke had first told her about his mother. He found her there minutes later, settling beside her without a word, simply taking her hand in his as the sound of distant laughter drifted through the garden. "Regretting the small wedding already?" he asked, a teasing note in his voice that would have seemed impossible from the guarded man she had met all those months ago. "Never," she said. "I was only thinking of how far we have come, from that first terrified walk across the ballroom to this. It feels almost impossible, when I consider it plainly. Very little about courage feels possible until someone actually attempts it," he said, echoing words he had spoken to her months earlier, in this very garden. "You taught me that, whether you intended to or not." She rested her head against his shoulder, watching the late afternoon light scatter across the surface of the pond, and thought of every fear she had carried since that first reckless dare, every whispered rumor, every moment of doubt about whether courage alone could withstand the weight of scandal and jealousy determined to tear them apart. All of it had led, improbably, to this quiet garden, to a man who had once frightened the whole of London now sitting beside her, with nothing guarded left in his expression at all. "Thank you," she said softly, "for refusing to let me go." "I intend to keep refusing," he said, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head, "for the rest of our lives, if you will allow it." "I would not want it any other way," Evelina answered, and together they sat in comfortable silence, as the sounds of their wedding celebration continued warmly behind them, two people who had found, against every expectation society had placed upon them, exactly where they were meant to be. A year passed at Ravensmoor with a quiet steadiness Evelina had never quite imagined possible for herself, a life measured not in scandal or spectacle but in small, accumulating moments of genuine happiness. The townhouse in London remained theirs for the busy weeks of the season, but it was the countryside estate, with its old garden and its ivy-covered walls, that had truly become home. Word arrived one spring morning that Lady Constance had married a minor baronet from a distant county, a match considerably beneath what she had once believed herself destined for. Evelina read the news without malice, only a quiet, distant sort of relief that the woman who had once tried so hard to destroy her happiness had found some path forward of her own, however far from the grand ambitions she had once held. Charlotte, emboldened by her sister's example, had begun attracting her own quiet suitor, a scholarly young gentleman with a passion for botany who seemed entirely unbothered by her sharp tongue and quicker wit, finding both qualities charming rather than intimidating. Margaret, meanwhile, remained determinedly unattached, declaring loudly and often that she intended to enjoy several more seasons of freedom before settling on any single gentleman's attention, a declaration their mother received with exasperated affection rather than any real objection. The Duke, no longer regarded by London as the reclusive, feared figure he had once been, found himself instead the subject of an entirely different sort of gossip, whispered admiration for the transformation that marriage had wrought upon him. He laughed more easily now, attended gatherings he once would have avoided entirely, and made no secret of the deep affection he held for his wife, a devotion that had become, in its own quiet way, one of London's favorite stories to retell. Evelina spent her mornings often in the old garden, tending carefully to the roses that had once belonged to her husband's mother, a task she had taken up not from any sense of obligation but from genuine tenderness toward the memory it represented. She had, over the months, learned every corner of the estate's history, every small story the Duke shared more freely now that trust between them had grown as steady and rooted as the old oak trees shading the garden paths. "You seem thoughtful this morning," the Duke said one afternoon, finding her seated on the familiar stone bench, a half-finished letter to Charlotte resting forgotten in her lap. "I was thinking of the dare," Evelina admitted, smiling faintly at the memory. "How strange it feels now, looking back. A single reckless moment, and it changed absolutely everything." "Do you regret it?" he asked, settling beside her, though his tone made clear he already suspected her answer. "Never," she said immediately. "I only wonder sometimes what might have happened if I had lost my nerve, if I had let my sisters laugh, and simply stayed at the edge of that ballroom the way I always had before. Then we would both still be exactly where we were, he said. You overlooked and underestimated, and I hiding behind a reputation I built specifically to keep everyone at a distance. I am endlessly grateful you did not lose your nerve. Evelina leaned against his shoulder, watching a pair of sparrows dart between the rose bushes, the quiet contentment of the moment settling warmly through her. She thought of the frightened, determined girl who had crossed that ballroom floor a year earlier, certain only that she refused to be told what she could not do, and marveled at how completely that single act of stubborn courage had reshaped the entire course of her life. News arrived that summer that Evelina was expecting their first child, news that spread through both families with tremendous joy, her mother nearly overcome with happiness at the prospect of grandchildren, Lady Harriet already planning which corner of the nursery ought to receive the morning sun. The Duke, for all his composed dignity in public matters, proved entirely unable to hide his delight, spending long evenings discussing names and possibilities, with an enthusiasm that made Evelina laugh more often than she could remember laughing in her entire life before meeting him. Autumn brought the birth of a daughter, small and healthy and possessed of her father's serious dark eyes from the very first moment she opened them, though it was not long before she also displayed her mother's stubborn refusal to be easily deterred, howling with considerable determination whenever anything failed to meet her satisfaction. They named her Rosalind, after the garden that had first brought her parents' hearts together, and Lady Harriet declared, with evident satisfaction, that the old rose bushes had never looked lovelier than they did that autumn, as though they too understood the significance of the new life now woven into the estate's long history. Years later, when Rosalind was old enough to ask about her parents' courtship, Evelina would tell the story exactly as it happened, without exaggeration or softening. The dare, the scandal, the public confrontation that had nearly cost them everything before finally securing it permanently. She told her daughter that courage rarely felt heroic in the moment it was required, that it usually looked instead like a single small, terrified step taken anyway, followed by another, until somehow the impossible distance had been crossed. And then what happened? Rosalind would always ask, though she already knew the answer, having heard the story told a dozen times before. Then, Evelina would say, smiling at the memory that never lost its warmth no matter how many years passed, your father refused to let me go, and he never has, not for a single day since. The Duke, listening from the doorway more often than either of them realized, would smile at hearing the familiar words, thinking back to a crowded ballroom, and a young woman with more courage than the entire assembled company combined, who had crossed an impossible distance, simply because she refused to be told what she could not do. Whatever fear had once kept him locked behind careful walls of reputation and distance, she had dismantled it entirely, not through any grand gesture, but through the steady, patient honesty she had offered him from that very first moment, and continued offering still, every single day that followed. A second child followed 2 years later, a son they named Edmund after the Duke's own father, and the once quiet halls of the Ravensmoor estate filled steadily with the sound of small running feet, laughter echoing off walls that had stood silent and grieving for far too many years before Evelina's arrival changed everything. Lady Harriet, growing older but no less sharp of eye, took particular delight in spoiling both children thoroughly, insisting it was an aunt's rightful privilege, and refusing to hear any argument otherwise from either exasperated parent. Charlotte married her botanist within the year, settling on a modest but comfortable estate not far from Ravensmoor, close enough that the sisters visited each other frequently, their old childhood closeness deepening rather than fading with the passing seasons. Margaret, true to her word, enjoyed several more years of unattached freedom, before finally consenting to marry a naval captain she met quite by accident at one of Evelina's own garden gatherings, a match that surprised everyone except Margaret herself, who had apparently known within the first quarter hour of conversation that she had found someone equal to her own restless spirit. Evelina's mother lived long enough to see all 3 of her daughters happily settled, spending her final years dividing her time between their various households, delighting in a growing collection of grandchildren who kept her thoroughly and happily occupied. She spoke often, in those later years, of the evening her youngest daughter had crossed a ballroom on nothing more than stubborn pride, calling it the finest decision any of her children had ever made, though she was quick to add, with a fond and knowing smile, that she had never doubted for a moment that Evelina possessed exactly the courage such a moment required. The Duke himself changed considerably over the years that followed his marriage, the guarded reputation that once defined him fading steadily into memory, replaced by the quiet, contented figure of a man thoroughly devoted to his family and the steady rhythms of country life. He remained sharp-witted and occasionally formidable in matters of business or politics, But the coldness that had once kept the whole of London at careful distance had long since melted away entirely, warmed by years of steady, patient love that had asked nothing of him except honesty in return. On quiet evenings, long after the children had been put to bed and the household had settled into comfortable silence, Evelina and the Duke often found themselves back in the old garden, sitting together on the familiar stone bench beneath the ancient oak tree, watching the last light fade slowly behind the hedges. It had become over the years their favorite place in the entire estate, a quiet corner that held within it the whole history of everything they had built together, from that very first vulnerable conversation about a mother lost too young, to every year of partnership that had followed since. "Do you ever think," Evelina asked him once, many years into their marriage, "about what might have happened if my sisters had dared someone else that evening, or if I had simply refused the challenge?" "Often," he admitted, drawing her closer against his side, "and every single time, I find myself profoundly grateful that you did not refuse. I do not know what shape my life would have taken otherwise, but I know with absolute certainty that it would have been considerably lonelier." Evelina smiled, resting her head against his shoulder as the evening settled softly around them, the garden quiet except for the distant sound of birdsong and the gentle rustle of leaves overhead. Whatever fear had once driven her across that crowded ballroom floor, whatever uncertainty had followed in the difficult weeks after, all of it had led, improbably and wonderfully, to exactly this: a life built not on scandal or spectacle, but on the steady, patient courage of two people who had simply refused to let each other go.